Good morning. Thanks for joining us. So let's kick things off. I would love it if everyone could do just a quick intro, tell us about yourselves and the work that you're doing, and then just an example of true inclusion that you've experienced or witnessed. David, sorry, we'll start with you and we'll go down the line. I'm so sorry. It's been a while, folks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is David Yossi. I'm the Executive Vice President for the Workplace Division of TextHelp. TextHelp builds and develops assistive technology. Some of you may be familiar with it because your children may be using it if they're dyslexic, autistic, have ADHD. We got our start in K through 12. I represent what we consider the private sector. So those children who have those conditions or situations grow up and become adults and still have those conditions. So we build technology that supports them in the workplace as well. A story is one of the common issues or challenges in the workplace is that employees generally don't tend to self-identify. It's either uncomfortable, they're afraid of competition, promotions, there's all kinds of issues. And so one of the most enjoyable and most heartwarming experiences is to actually see somebody become comfortable with raising their hand, saying they have a condition or need some assistance, and the way in which our technology really makes a difference in their lives, essentially making it easier and them more productive.
Lara?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lara McLeod. I lead inclusion, equity, and belonging at Robinhood. Really excited to work there, particularly because our mission is to democratize finance for all. And so in the vein of true inclusion, I really love to see true inclusion in products, socially inclusive design, and being from a Black woman from the Black community, I find it really inclusive to think about how we can bring financial awareness, financial accessibility to communities that have often lacked that, and it's created more of a gap in our financial resources. And so working in this space has been an opportunity for me to really see true inclusion in product.
Thank you for joining us.
Of course.
Vida?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vida Johnson. I'm Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Edelman. Edelman is a communications and PR consultancy where I help my clients develop and implement actionable DEI strategies. Those that have measurable, time-bound goals, something that you can really hang your hat on. And even just there's been a very recent example of thinking about true inclusion. I got to help one of my clients. It's an energy company when they were thinking through some of their D&I awards that they wanted to really recognize employees and engage them. And I said, okay, that's great. Who's on the selection committee? And they were like, oh, just us in this room. And I said, this is an opportunity for you to really open this up. And I could just see their eyes widen, and it was an opportunity for them to really think about ways that you can include even when you're recognizing others that are doing inclusion.
Absolutely. DeShaun?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
There was absolutely no energy in that. We are here talking about inclusion. Can we be inclusive, please? Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. I am DeShaun Porter, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and the Global Recognition Team for Hilton, where every stay is about a memorable experience.
Nice.
In terms of true inclusion, I actually got an amazing story that kind of came to mind when we were talking about this, sitting over there. And for me, I think inclusion is literally grounded in two things. One, it's your ability to be vulnerable and say, I'm not going to always get things right, but I'm going to try. And then two, your willingness to learn. And so I can tell you a story. We have a general manager, it'll only be quick, guys. We have a general manager that's based on the West Coast. And for every quarter, he does a celebratory event for his leadership team, and they all come together. And he has one of his team members is in a wheelchair. And the restaurant that they go to, they always take over the bar area. So as you can imagine, it's all of these high boys. And, they always look out for her. They're always like, I can get your food. And she would, for many months, just say, well, maybe we should try another place. Like just being semi-suggestive, but not incredibly direct to where not, everyone could get it. And I literally heard about this and reached out to the general manager, had known him for a few years, and was just like, hey, and all I did was explain to him the situation. Didn't say anything. He was like, oh my gosh, I've got somebody on my team, and I think I've been doing that. I didn't say that it was him, right? I didn't say that. I was just like, so give me an idea. I've got to figure out a way to address this. And he was like, oh my gosh. And you could see it on his face. Like literally, he was stuck. And then his body language changed. And he was like hunched over like this on the phone. I can see him on the video. And he's like, I've got an apology that I need to make. Can I go? I'm gonna call you back. Got off of the phone with me. Ever since then, this leader has taken to the stage to find out, identify resources, talk to our partners, talk to other individuals in and outside of that community to understand how to be inclusive. And they have literally ascended to be one of our most inclusive leaders and a strong ally for all of our communities. And so that is what inclusion, true inclusion, means to me.
That's an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think this is a great way to kind of start us all off. And DeShaun, I'm going to go to you first for this first question here. An effective but sometimes overlooked method of improving inclusion and belonging is simply just to listen. Now, your example that you just shared, I feel like perfectly exemplifies that. But how can that be promoted in an organization, both in the culture and the structure? How can you make sure that everyone feels as though they're part of the conversation, really being listened to?
Yeah, so I recently wrote an article about psychological safety and what does that actually mean? And it means different things for different people. And so you have to start with the ability for an organization, its leaderships, all of you, to be able to practice active listening. It's a very easy concept, but for whatever reason, it's difficult to practice. As adults, our attention span, we literally have a new thought every 7 to 8 seconds, right? And it's probably decreased a little bit through COVID, but we're not gonna count that. And so it's how can you foster ways within small groups as well as larger groups at your companies to have these active listening sessions. And you don't have to call them, you don't have to frame it as an active listening session. You can take, if any of your companies are currently doing a global team member survey or an employment engagement survey, leveraging some of those particular topics and saying, we're going to dissect these across a couple of weeks and talk about each of these different topics. That allows you to actually hear from people. But what I can tell you is, sometimes we will set ourselves up for failure. If you are having these discussions and you are not prepared to act on it, as she said, take action, don't have the discussion. That is where you lose people. You're gonna do a survey the following year and they're not going to wanna engage. Or you're gonna get these very surfaced answers and not understand why you're seeing all these declines in several different dimensions. And so I think that's key. I can say a few years ago, we launched a series of conversations called Courageous Conversations. We've talked about everything from systemic racism to mental health to addiction. We've gone into IVF and fertility. We've leaned into all of these topics, and really when you take it back several years ago, those things were taboo in the workplace, right? But we wanted to foster an environment where you can actually bring your whole selves to work, right? Nobody literally wakes up, walks into their office and is like, okay, 9 to 5, I'm not worried about anything that I had going on before. None of us have that light switch, and if you do, I'd be willing to buy it, right? But so we wanna make sure that these companies, that our companies, are offering benefits and offering environments and creating an inclusive space to allow you to talk about these things in an appropriate way. I will say that.
Oh yeah, don't look at me. I'm here to, absolutely, you don't have to raise your hand. This is meant to be a conversation. I feel like we're all just kind of here to learn. So please feel free to jump in, Vida.
I just wanted to add, That was excellent point. But when you're thinking also about kind of listening, when I talk about the DEI journey, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So even that individual leader listening is so important for psychological safety and just for, in general, the culture of your organization. And what I encourage my clients to do always is listen, of course, active listening, but also listen like what they have to say is just as important as what you have to say or what you're thinking. So now you're thinking like, okay, because normally maybe I wouldn't because they're not the same title or above, or maybe I don't need them for anything in particular. And this is someone I'm just meeting. Maybe they have a background that I'm not used to. But if you go into it thinking what they have to say is valuable and equally valuable to what I would have to say or someone that I truly respect, then that's really where the true inclusion and the true like listening and the culture work begins.
Yeah, I'll add on to that by saying that oftentimes when I'm talking about active listening, especially with leaders or really with anyone, these topics are really emotionally charged, even if nothing is happening in the political climate, right? And I say listen to understand, not be understood or to respond, because we're so focused on what we have to say or our intent, because we don't ever intend to not be inclusive, to be creating inequitable systems, et cetera. And so oftentimes I'll also say take the intent out of it. Assume that if someone is coming to you and sharing their experience, being vulnerable, that they assume you have positive intent and they are trying to connect with you in a way to get past that. And then after you listen to understand, if you're having those strong reactions, ask yourself why. Take a moment, right? Don't respond immediately. Don't come up with an answer because there might not be an answer in that moment. But then also just ask, how can we fix this? What is the action that makes sense? Because we assume that we understand how we need to fix something for someone, but oftentimes we're looking past the root cause of what they need to try to find what we think is the easiest or the right solution or the best practice, if you will. And so asking that question, taking it in, can also be a really simple way of thinking about equity and giving everyone what they need to equally thrive.
Absolutely.
The only thing I would add to those great points is always find listening, if it's really happening, is to be an intimate experience. Oddly enough, I'll use myself, I'm oftentimes uncomfortable in those interactions. And it's mostly because I'm in my own head, where I'm not focusing on the other person. And I notice that when I do that, I'm actually able to connect with them and create a more deeper experience. And it makes me uncomfortable. And I think that's just a human condition. I don't know why exactly that happens, but I do know the way I am able to overcome differences, or particularly in this environment today, is to just deeply listen and allow that intimate connection to take place.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all so much. Before we move on, I'm gonna offer one piece of like little nugget that y'all can take away. Someone gave me the advice once that they walk into every room with the assumption that they are the least interesting person in that room. And having that bit of humility about yourself, I think, opens you up to not only listen more, but ask more questions. So do with that what you will. Lara, at Robinhood, a large part of the company's mission is about democratizing finances. In what ways can DE&I leaders and companies work to emphasize the E with equity in mind?
That's a great question. And of course, I've been talking a lot about equity so far. I think this is a really great opportunity to bake it into your bottom line, your product, your mission, right? And so that's one of the reasons I chose Robinhood, was because of the mission to democratize finance for all. That has equity baked into it, because that means that we need to bring a different approach to communities, to people who have less access. And so the way that I think about this is actually taking the word equity out of it, because we bring a lot of different meanings to these acronyms or these buzzwords of which we've created DEIB. And instead, it's really about socially inclusive design. It's about human-centered student-centered design and baking accessibility into the bottom line, not as edge cases that you deal with after the product has formed, but really thinking about access at its core the moment that an idea strikes you. Hiring so that you have the folks in the room that can represent the things that you're not seeing in terms of equitable access. And then, of course, going out and engaging with those communities, right? And so not only from a social impact perspective of trying to put your brand out there, but really making sure that you're actively listening to these communities when you're, trying to create that access, hearing where the pain points are, where the barriers are, and bringing those back to your product teams, using your ERGs and leveraging those folks who are putting in so much time and have a wealth of knowledge that oftentimes goes untapped, creating the systems so that you're not burdening them or overburdening them, creating other inequitable systems within your company, but really making sure that they have a say at the product decision-making table.
Great. If there's anybody else who wants to add anything before we move on, please feel free to hop in.
Can I hop in? Because
Yeah.
I know that we're all amongst friends and we're all very well versed, but I always like when we're having these conversations being really, really clear about the difference between equity and equality. I know that a lot of people are like, oh, yes, we get it. But equity is let me stop. When you start with equality, you're saying that we're giving everyone kind of equal resources, but that only works if everyone starts at the same place. And I'm reminded that one of my colleagues was sharing about how a story, just to kind of display, to illustrate this, is that the school kids come in from from recess, and the teacher sees that someone's scraped their knee. So she says, oh no, let me give you a Band-Aid. And so they're like, okay, and everything's fine. The next student comes in and has broken their leg. So she says, oh no, let me give you a Band-Aid. And that is not what the student that broke their leg needs. You have to account for the different spaces where people start. And that's key to this work.
Right. Okay, David. So during an early conversation, you mentioned that, tech really has the power to create inclusive spaces. Can you talk a little bit just about how to creatively and effectively use technology to support inclusion efforts in the workplace? Sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied.
That's great. I often get that way. So one of the cool things about being in a tech firm is you get to see things change so rapidly and so fast and evolve. And AI now and ChatGPT and these things are sort of coming at us so fast. It's really hard to know, understand, and sort of digest all of it. And so what we try to do is make it simple. I mentioned earlier that a lot of children use our technology in K through 12. And the reason why that there's such vast adoption, we have over 20 million current users, is the fact that it is simple and it's easy and it's accessible. Today, your phone has probably 30, 40, 50 different applications. Your desktop, if you're running Chrome or Windows, is dozens and dozens of applications. So how do you simplify things and how do you scale that? And so what we really focus on is creating simplicity but accessibility at the same time. And this notion of accessing that in the flow of work. So years and years ago, there was, I worked for a company that called something the on-demand workplace. And the technology was really early at that point, but what was really cool is it tried to personalize the experience. And that made a huge difference in how I access things. I'm actually dyslexic. I was diagnosed as a first grader. And unfortunately, back then, they didn't have some of these tools and systems. And so I struggled quite a bit and struggled finding things and the resources I needed. What we focus on and what we think is important is that accessibility and that persistence so that I don't have to go look for something, that it's in the flow of my work and my day-to-day experience. That if you've had that or know what that's like, it definitely changes your experience. And I would also say that in terms of this notion of performance and success, A lot of it has to do with empowering your employees to have what they need when they need it, not to have to go ask for it or look for it.
Well, I think you bring up a good point there, right? Because some folks in DE&I may not know, what technology to offer their employees, or to a lot of times employees don't even know that they have access to these things. So, for anyone who wants to answer, how do your companies show up for employees and let them know, hey, if you have a technology that you need to help you do your job better, we have it. We can provide it for you.
I'll weigh in by saying that I actually, the way that I think it works best is saying, not necessarily saying we have it, but let's have a conversation, right? I think that in many cases, especially when you're talking about accessibility, equity in terms of neurodivergence or unseen disabilities, or even visible disabilities, there's so much fear about asking the question that oftentimes it can go unaddressed in terms of the technology that you need. Again, you mentioned they might not even know what they need. And so having the conversation, understanding what it is that they need from not even a platform perspective, but just what's hard. You can then go do the research and admit that you don't have the answers, but you're willing to put in the time and the effort to find out. I often find that if you give folks effort, they will give you grace, and you can work together to create that experience.
Absolutely.
I can chime in. So I think it goes back to the whole psychological safety thing. People are scared to ask because they feel as though they're going to have kind of like a target on them or something, the wrong attention, if you will. And so what we've done is we've definitely done, and we continue to do a strong job in educating our managers around accommodations, right? And making sure that we are also promoting and highlighting stories across our entire organization that demonstrate, it brings it to life. If somebody's willing to share, I went out and I had this accommodation and I'm utilizing this today, and it's driving greater performance. Doing it through storytelling creates and fosters the environment to say, I'm safe here in which to be able to share this, and they want me to be successful. And so therefore, they're gonna lean in and help me to identify the solutions that will enable that even easier. So, we're gonna hopefully be able to continue and see more companies come to the plate and do it as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've seen is a lot of companies, big or small, they use those kind of ready-made tools that help with closed captioning or anything in that kind of field. But all I say to my clients is also be willing and open and vulnerable to changing direction. Yes, these different resources, sometimes they do cost a lot of money, it costs a lot of time, or you have to change or shift. But please make this about the folks that need the resources and not about your company providing the resources. And this matters because sometimes it doesn't work in the same intention that you would like it to. Very specifically, I'm thinking about PowerPoint because I just had that for one of my healthcare clients. They were like, make sure that it's accessible, but you can make it accessible by saying, oh, this is an image. And that way they get it and it says it's accessible. Now, if someone who might have vision impairment issues, they should be empowered to be able to say something even when it's a tool and you did the extra step and you did the extra mile. Because at the end of the day, it's really about them and not about your providing this for them.
Yeah. So I don't need to tell anyone in this room that the outside world can have a big impact in our corporate offices, at home. I'm thinking, firstly, the murder of George Floyd, the Dobbs decision. I could go on and on about how the outside world impacts our workplaces. Let's look at how the response of corporate leadership affects the sense of inclusion in the workplace. And Vida, I'm going to start with you here, but how can team members within an organization get buy-in from senior leaders to move inclusion and belonging efforts forward so that employees have a greater psychological safety?
Thank you for asking. I actually get asked this every single day.
Do you really?
Oh, yes, because of course I work in diversity, equity, inclusion for a communications firm. So every single day clients are like, what's going on in the industry landscape? What are they doing? Should we continue to move this forward? And I tell them, okay, I've been working in this space since before 2020, which is apparently the line in the sand from when racism began. But I was like, there are going to be some cyclical things in the news where you get more support and then sometimes there's a little bit of a back off. I will say that between 2022, 2023, there was a lot more in the news and in the media about companies. First and foremost, 2022 was kind of reneging on their support for external partnerships and organizations. I remember kind of the first stories being about everyone was like, we're gonna, there's an issue with our employees, but we're gonna write a lot of checks to the NAACP and Black Lives Matter and the Trevor Project and whomever else. And then it ended up being loans, or they just didn't give it to them. So that was kind of the first wave. And then you started getting the legislation. And then the most recent was last summer with kind of the Supreme Court overturning race-based, very clear, race-based affirmative action for higher education institutions, but not all higher education institutions, because they very strategically left out the military ones. So then we had clients saying, what should we do? Should we pull back? And I was like, well, take a minute, take a breather, take a pause, because this work is still valuable. So the first things first is that you need to make sure that your leaders understand, and I hate saying the business case, but the impact case for DEI. Diverse organizations perform better. We're going to increasingly progress. We are a global marketplace. We're just in general. So the way you've always done things, it's not going to help propel you into the future. So you have to be prepared and ready to speak to people from a lot of different backgrounds and to address consumers from a lot of different backgrounds. So that's just top of the line. So if we can start there and then start with removing barriers and reducing inequities, that's really kind of making the impact case for DEI to your leaders, and then flooding with them with education, because there's going to be tons of misinformation. Everybody likes a little clickbait on the internet. Everybody likes to see, what's this say on Instagram? But stay focused, stay the course. It is so worth it.
I'll add that, I think post-2020, or even in 2020, you saw a lot of employers starting with these external statements of, I stand with the Black community, I stand with X community. And what I love about this moment right now is that it's an opportunity for us to recognize that before we do anything else, we need to make sure our employees are okay. And we need to make sure that what they need in that moment, we are addressing. Whatever we decide from a business case afterward, whether or not it fits our impact, right? I love that. I'm gonna totally take that and bring it back. But regardless of whether or not it aligns with what we can put forward into the community, you ask yourself externally, what do we have to add to this conversation? If it's another clickbait soundbite, maybe don't say it, because it's not actually going to move anything forward. But make sure that you're asking your employees, you're preparing your managers with the material they need to take care of their employees. And that doesn't mean sitting that employee down and saying, are you okay? It means taking the lead, having enough emotional intelligence to be able to understand when you as a manager need to address something as a team with a particular person, when your leaders need to say something or not say something because they know that there's no way you're gonna win. Also ask yourself, I say this on a regular basis, do we have employees that are impacted? If we're dealing with geopolitical issues, global issues, ask yourself if that's something we need to say something about in this moment because employees are impacted, or if we're just saying something to say something and to stir up more. The more you can be informed and really form a meaningful opinion, be intentional, and make sure that you're supporting and providing your employees with the psychological safety they need to belong, that's gonna be the most important thing you can do across the board.
Well, Lara, you bring up a great point too, right? Because I think so often we think of DE&I in a US-centric view, Do you all find that as well? And how do you make sure that you think about it in a global mindset of what your global employees need? I apologize, this was not a prepared question. I'm just curious.
It's an excellent question. I mean, listen, Hilton is in over 126 countries, right? And so we do look at it from a global lens. We've got regional DEI councils, and it's meeting with them so I can have a pulse. Obviously, I can, observe what's kind of going on, and we've got all of our different partners that provide us updates on a regional perspective. But definitely, I meet with the inclusion councils, and we lean in to get a true understanding of how our team members are feeling. But what I wanted to also point on is Laura's point is, you've got to also check your own self, right? I think, yes, it's important for us to kind of come around and have focus groups or have meetings and talk about these things, but also do a self-check and say, how am I showing up as an ally? And can I shift from just putting up a nice little social media black box and say, I support this group, to actually being an advocate? An advocate is someone who is willing to utilize their position of privilege for the benefit of others. We all have privilege. And it's so essentially, how are you showing up for somebody other than yourself, for another group? And where do you have a gap? When you think about, there's so many different communities, so many different intersectionalities, where are your gaps in terms of understanding various communities for which you might not today be a part of? Which is huge. And I think we have to think about that. So going back to the global segment, it's that active listening, but it's also making sure that your strategies support it. And then it's being able to have a strategy that can flex regionally. Because honestly, the way that we are reporting here in the US on DEI right now is different than how my reports are looking in EMEA or in Asia Pacific or in Latin America. It's completely different. And we have to make sure that, obviously, as a company that's based in the US, that we're putting in some safeguards. We're also allowing those countries to do essentially what it is that they need to do to drive their particular goals and to make an inclusive environment for what it means there as well.
Yeah.
Don't wait as well. Don't wait until something happens to start bringing that global lens into view. Every single country is different. It looks different. It feels different. There are different requirements if you're in the EU or the UK or the US or Canada. And so figure the landscape out early. Understand the nuances, even if you're, for instance, in a different country that has different laws when it comes to self-identification and things of that nature, to really try to understand what you're working with and get a baseline, and also build a very detailed plan ahead of time for each country that you have an office in or a location or you're doing work in.
Yeah. Return to office is still a hot debate. Just curious, how many folks in the audience report into the office at least 3 days a week? Okay. Excuse me, from a DE&I perspective though, research has shown that LGBTQ, BIPOC, disabled workers have all benefited from remote work. How can businesses build DE&I into their RTO strategies? David, I'll kick it to you first.
So as a company, we are global as well. We're actually still fully remote. We do have offices where our employees can go to, but as you can imagine, being a technology company, we pretty much encourage people to do either. And so what we try to focus on is, as you're suggesting, how is our technology allowing or enabling our employees to have just as a meaningful experience from home as they do in the office. What we're finding though, there's some changes or differences in demographics, particularly for the younger population coming up now. They're actually craving the ability to access an office or see other people in person. So we're trying to do a number of different things that not only includes technology, but includes strategies to bring people together, whether it's quarterly events or special kinds of activities through the use of our technology. But it's really varied, and we're still sort of trying to figure it out. I don't think we've cracked the code quite yet on what the right answer is.
Is anyone cracking the code?
I don't think it's possible yet. It's still developing, right? But I think what we have to do is remember that in many cases, folks will not be going back to the office even if there is an RTO mandate, right? And so from a DEI perspective, it keeps me up at night when I think about, yes, we need to create those in-person moments and moments of connection, both for people going back to office, year-round for teams that are in different locations, but then also making sure that when we're creating those moments in office, we're not forgetting that in many cases, we still live in a hybrid workforce. There are people, myself included, who have invisible disabilities and are fearful of going back into the office for health reasons, for neurodivergent reasons, things of that nature. And so being mindful that we need to still crack the code on hybrid workplaces, not remote, not in office, but how do we really think about how to include people who are in different working environments.
And what I would add is, I know that we don't want to stop at only DEI education and training, but it's really important that your organizations have a shared language for how to talk about these things, how to talk about microaggressions, how to talk about intersectionality, how to talk about allyship, accomplices. Just really having people around you so that if something, if I do have an interaction that might make me a little uncomfortable, there are people around where I don't have to experience it and then also stand up for it by myself. Like I really feel a sense of inclusion and belonging.
Yeah, I'll add in, I don't know that we've fully cracked the code. What I will say is, to what David said, there's a lot of people who have the desire in which to be able to be back in the office now. In the absence of any mandate, we've kind of gone the flexible route in which to say it's highly encouraged. There's amazing things that's taking place in our office each and every day. If you want crumble cookies, you never know when it's gonna pop up. So, you're just, it's a gamble, right? But you wanna be present, or you quickly get to the office as soon as you find out that it's happening that day, right? But we truly encourage our managers to take the approach of being flexible, recognizing that each of us have our own lives outside of the office, right? You might be caregivers, and you could be in the sandwich generation where you're caregiving up as well as down. And so that's a different demand on your time, monitoring traffic schedules and all of that stuff. And so to date, it's worked well. Another thing that we did is we had, I basically held a few meetings with our ERGs. So we have 9 of them at Hilton, and they're global. Right? 6 of them are global today. And so literally holding it across the entire globe to get an understanding of how are they feeling, what are they needing in which to kind of make this transition as we're transitioning from a COVID environment, everybody being at home, to, definitely somewhat hybrid, and all depending on the different team that you're on. And so it's been great. Again, that's that active listening piece, but making sure then we're therefore taking action based on the feedback that we're getting.
Believe it or not, we are pretty much out of time. I didn't even get through half of my questions for you all. But thank you all so much for joining us. You have been an absolute wealth of knowledge. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.